In 3 territories, they knew her only as the woman with the blade, and the name they whispered made grown men check the shadows. She rode into Sage Flats, tracking a $200 bounty, carrying a naginata across her back and a lacquered box she hadn't opened in 3 years. The man who offered her shelter was a rancher named Hank Dalton, and he was the first person in the West to look at her without flinching. What he saw beneath the blade would either cost him the ranch he'd spent his life building, or give her a reason to set it down for good. Stay until the end to see how this unfolds, and if it moves you, hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The trading post at Coyote Wash had the look of a place that existed because someone's horse died there and they never found a reason to leave. Ray dismounted in the afternoon heat, her boots settling into packed earth as the naginata shifted across her back with a sound like a branch bending in wind. She wore a kimono beneath a dust-coated trail coat, the silk a faded indigo that had once been the color of deep water, and her jet-black hair was pinned in a traditional Japanese knot that held despite 3 days of desert riding. Her face was all sharp angles beneath fair skin, high cheekbones catching the light, and her almond-shaped dark eyes swept the post with the slow patience of someone counting exits. The man behind the counter recognized her before she reached the door. His hand stopped halfway to the rifle propped against the wall, hung there, then dropped to the counter like it had never moved. She'd torn the wanted poster from a telegraph pole outside Prescott 2 weeks ago. Deacon Pye, $200, robbery and assault, last seen heading toward Sage Flats. The poster was folded inside her coat now, next to the pouch where she kept bounty money separate from everything else, and next to the lacquered box wrapped in cloth that she never let out of arm's reach. She bought coffee and hardtack with coins she counted twice, and the man made change with hands that shook like he was handling something hot. Nobody in the post spoke while she was there. A rancher in the corner held his tin cup in front of his mouth for the entire duration, using the rim as a shield so he wouldn't have to meet her eyes. She drank slow, watching the road through the window, and when she left, the silence inside broke open like a dam giving way. 3 days of tracking brought her to the ridge above Sage Flats, where the whole town lay in the shallow valley below. 3 saloons, 2 general stores, a sheriff's office with a sign that hung crooked on one nail. She could see Pye's horse tied outside the second saloon, a bay gelding with a brand she recognized from the poster, and she could see the man himself through the dirty window, holding court at a corner table, with 2 men who laughed too loud at nothing. Ray checked the naginata's edge with her thumb. The blade was clean, the curve catching the last light in a line so fine it looked like the air had been cut and hadn't closed yet. She'd carried this weapon since she was 14. Trained in its use by a family that understood a woman's reach was her first defense and her last. The shaft was oak, dark with years of grip, and the blade had taken more notches than she counted anymore. She settled it across her back and started down the ridge, and the box shifted against her ribs with each step, its weight as familiar as her own heartbeat. The afternoon sun hammered the main street, packed dirt and wagon ruts, and the town responded the way frontier towns always did when something walked in that they couldn't categorize. Doors closed and conversations stopped. A woman pulling laundry from a line gathered it and went inside without looking back. She found Pye in the second saloon, a place called the Lost Spur, with doors hanging open on leather hinges. He sat with 2 companions, a half-empty bottle between them, his wanted poster description matching him down to the scar on his left jaw. He was bigger than she'd expected, thick through the chest, with the kind of weight that came from years of taking things from people who had less. Ray stepped through the doors and the room changed temperature. Pye's 2 companions looked at her, looked at the blade, and their faces went through a calculation that ended with them remembering they had somewhere else to be. They left their drinks and walked out without a word. Pi reached for the revolver on his hip, and Ray moved the way water moves when it finds a crack in stone, fluid and inevitable and done before the stone knows it's been split. The naginata swept in a low arc that caught the revolver and sent it spinning, and the follow-through brought the blade flat against his throat, with enough pressure to pin him to the chair. The whole thing took less time than it takes to tell. She bound his wrists, collected the revolver, and walked him to the sheriff's office. The sheriff counted the bounty from the territory fund with a resigned air. $200, which Ray added to the pouch she kept separate from everything else. The trouble started after. Pi had friends who rode in from the south that evening shooting, and Ray answered from behind the sheriff's office with the kind of precision that came from years of fighting people who had guns when she had something better. It was short and ugly, but in the crossfire, a stray bullet found Ray's horse, and the animal dropped in the street, and with it dropped her way out of Sage Flats. She stood in the road with the naginata in one hand and the box clutched against her ribs, and for the first time and longer than she could remember, she didn't have a next step. The horse was dead, the town was locked behind shuttered windows, and the sun was going down behind the ridge. Then a buckboard turned the corner at the far end of the street, loaded with fence posts and feed sacks, and the man driving it pulled up alongside the dead horse. He was broad across the shoulders, sun-darkened, with hands that looked like they'd built everything they'd ever touched. There was no gun on his hip. There was no rifle in the buckboard. He looked at the naginata, looked at the dead horse, looked at her, and said nothing for a long moment. "You need a ride somewhere, or are you planning to stand here until the coyotes decide your company?" His voice was flat and dry, the kind that carried no fear because it had never learned the tune. Ray studied him the way she studied every stranger, looking for the angle, the threat, the thing they wanted. She found nothing. He was just a man on a buckboard, offering a ride to a woman who'd just lost her horse in a gunfight. "Your horse is dead," he said. "I've got a ranch half a day north, room and board if you're willing to work. I need fence mended before the first frost, and from the look of you, you're not afraid of blisters." She should have said no. She should have walked to the next town, bought a horse with bounty money, and kept riding toward the name in the box. But the sun was going down, the town was shuttered, and the man on the buckboard was the first person in 3 territories who'd looked at the naginata and offered her work instead of a wide berth. She climbed onto the buckboard, laid the blade across her knees, and they drove north into the darkening valley without another word. The buckboard bounced along a trail that was more suggestion than road, fence posts rattling with each rut, and Ray watched the man beside her with the peripheral attention she gave everything. Hank Dalton drove with one hand on the reins, his posture the kind of loose that came from long years in the saddle until the body stopped fighting the movement and became part of it. He didn't talk. He didn't ask where she'd come from or what the blade was for, or why a Japanese woman was standing in a frontier street at sundown with a dead horse. He drove, and the night came on, and the kerosene lantern hanging from the buckboard's frame threw an amber light that flickered across the trail like something alive. The ranch appeared out of the dark the way frontier places did, shapes that resolved into meaning as they got closer. A cabin built from cottonwood logs, chinked with mud that had cracked and been patched. The barn leaned slightly east, as if trying to leave and never quite committing. Beyond the corral, a few horses lifted their heads at the sound of wheels and went back to their hay, and cattle spread across a grassy slope, their sound carrying in the night air like breathing. It wasn't much. It was everything. 2 men came out of the cabin as the buckboard stopped. The older one was lean and weathered, a man in his 60s with a beard the color of dry sage, and he looked at Ray the way a man looks at a rattlesnake in his kitchen. The younger one couldn't have been more than 20, and his reaction was less controlled. He stopped walking, stared at the naginata, and took a full step backward. "That's Jed, and that's Tucker," Hank said. "They work for me. They'll get used to you." Jed's expression suggested this was optimistic. Tucker's suggested he'd be sleeping with one eye open. Neither said anything, which told Ray that Hank Dalton ran a ranch where the hands kept their opinions to themselves. Hank showed her the small room off the barn, a space that had been a tack room before someone cleared it and nailed a cot to the wall. It was clean, dry, and had a window facing the corral, which meant she could see anyone coming from the south. Ray checked the sight lines, found the 2 exits, tested the latch, and set the lacquered box on the shelf above the cot. The box sat in the lamplight, its black lacquer surface catching the amber glow, and she let her hand rest on it for a moment before turning away. That night, Hank brought her a plate of food without being asked and without knocking. He set it on the stump outside her door, knocked once, and walked away. She ate sitting on the threshold with the naginata across her lap, fast and efficient, the food disappearing in bites that were measured and controlled. She'd learned long ago that meals could be interrupted or taken or never come again, and the lesson had settled into her body so deep it had become grammar, a syntax of survival that governed every motion. She didn't know it, but Hank stood on the cabin porch watching her eat, and what he saw wasn't a killer or a bounty hunter or the woman with the blade. He saw someone eating like the food might be the last she'd get, and something in his chest tightened around a feeling he hadn't had in years, the kind that came from recognizing a wound you couldn't see. The morning came cold and clear, the kind of frontier dawn that started gray and broke into light so sharp it felt like the sky was showing off. Ray was already outside when the ranch hands emerged, sharpening the naginata blade with a whetstone, the sound rhythmic and small. Jed watched from the cabin porch with the expression of a man doing math about how fast he could run. Tucker didn't come within 30 feet of her, which suited Ray fine. Hank walked past on his way to the corral, paused at the blade, catching the early light, looked at it the way a man looks at a well-made tool, and nodded once. He came back 10 minutes later with a bucket of water and set it outside her door without a word. The routine built itself over 3 days without anyone deciding it. Ray mended fence because she'd said she would, and her hands were as good with wire and posts as they were with the blade, the same discipline translating across tasks without friction. On the 3rd morning, Tucker came in from the south fence with a gash along his forearm where a splintered post had caught him deep. The wound was already turning, the skin red and tight, the kind of infection that frontier doctors treated with whiskey and amputation. Hank was pulling on his coat to ride 2 days for the nearest doctor when Ray walked into the cabin without being invited and set the lacquered box on the table. The room went still. She opened the box, and what Hank saw inside wasn't what he expected. Compartments fitted with small paper packets of dried herbs, a set of needles so fine they caught the kerosene lamplight and disappeared, and a folded cloth that smelled of camphor and something older, a practice older than the frontier itself. She worked without explaining. Her hands cleaned the wound with a solution she mixed from 2 packets, placed needles along his forearm at points she could have found in the dark, and bound a poultice of herbs against the wound with clean cloth. Tucker's breathing changed as the pain shifted from sharp and panicked to something duller and further away, and the tension in his shoulders released by degrees. Hank watched from the doorway, and what he saw was the same hands that held the naginata, the same precision, applied to healing instead of hurting. The connection landed in him like a stone dropping into still water. "She needs to keep it clean for 3 days," Ray said, not looking at Hank. "Change the poultice each morning. The herbs will draw out the infection." Hank nodded. "I hadn't expected that." She picked up the box. "You hadn't asked." That night, after the ranch hands had gone to bed, Ray sat outside her room with the box open on her knees. She took out a folded piece of paper and held it in the lamplight, characters brushed in ink that had faded but not disappeared. And her face changed. The woman who'd treated Tucker's wound was gone, and in her place was someone older and colder, looking at a name written in a language this frontier would never understand. She read the characters, folded the paper back, placed it inside the box with care that bordered on ritual, and closed the lid. Then she sat in the dark for a long time, the naginata across her lap, her eyes on the southern ridge. Hank saw the light from her window and thought about walking over, about asking what was in the box. But he'd spent enough years on the frontier to know that some doors didn't open because you knocked. So he went back to bed, and in the morning there was fresh water outside her door, and neither of them mentioned the box. What grew between them wasn't conversation, but a series of small actions that accumulated like snow on a fence line, each one insignificant alone, but together changing the shape of the landscape. She fixed a broken saddle strap without being asked, and the next morning there were 2 eggs on her plate. She started eating at the table instead of alone in her doorway. Hank's code revealed itself in pieces, never in declaration. He worked from before dawn until after dark, never complained, never raised his voice, never reached for a weapon. When a calf got stuck in a wash and the hands argued about how to get it out, Hank waded into the mud and pulled it free himself, and came out grinning like a boy. His code was protection without violence, provision without demand. And the more Ray watched it, the more it looked like a mirror of her own, turned to face a different direction. The south wind picked up that evening, carrying dust from the valley below, and Ray stood at the corral fence watching it build against the ridge the way weather builds before it breaks. She didn't know yet what was coming from the south, but the frontier had taught her that peace was never the destination, only a pause between storms. The rider came on the 5th morning, a man on a gray horse with a hat pulled low and a rifle across his saddle. He reined up at the cabin door with the practiced ease of someone who delivered messages for a living, and he didn't dismount. He looked at Ray sitting on the porch sharpening her blade, and his face went through a series of changes that ended with him looking at the sky. "Garrett Slade sends his regards to Mr. Dalton," he said to Hank. "He's offering fair price for the spring rights, 200 head and $1,000. He says this is his last offer." Hank drank his coffee. "The spring's on my land. It's not for sale." "Mr. Slade says everything's for sale. He says some things just take longer to agree on a price." "Tell Mr. Slade I said no. Tell him I said it polite." The rider looked at Ray one more time, and something crossed his face that was more than recognition. It was the look of a man who's just realized he's standing in a room with 2 kinds of trouble he didn't expect. He turned his horse and rode south, fast, and the dust hung in the still air like a question that hadn't been answered. Ray watched him go. Who is Garrett Slade? Runs the biggest spread in the valley, 3,000 head. He controls every water access from here to the river except mine. He's wanted this spring for 3 years because it's the only independent water source in 40 miles. And you won't sell. I built this ranch with my hands. Every post, every rail. I dug that spring out myself. A man's land isn't something he trades for cattle and cash. Ray understood land. She understood what it meant to lose ground your family had held for generations. But she didn't understand the refusal to fight for it. "If he comes for the spring, what will you do?" Hank looked at her, and for the first time she saw something behind the calm, something old and dark. "I swore off guns a long time ago, Ray. A man died because of a choice I made with a rifle in my hands. I decided that day I'd never pick one up again." "So he takes it and you watch." "I protect what's mine. I just don't do it with a gun." Slade didn't wait long. Within a week, his men cut the south fence in 3 places and scattered 60 head across the open range. 2 days later, someone dumped a dead carcass into the watering hole, and Hank spent a full day cleaning it out, wading into the water with his sleeves rolled up while the smell of rot hung over the ranch. He didn't go to the sheriff. He mended the fence, cleaned the water, and went back to work. Ray watched this with a frustration that built like pressure in a closed vessel. She'd killed men for less than what Slade was doing. She cornered Hank in the barn one evening while he nailed a loose board. "He's testing you. Every time you fix the fence, he learns you'll keep fixing it. You're teaching him you'll absorb it." Hank drove a nail. "I'm teaching him I won't be provoked." "You're teaching him you're weak." The hammer stopped. Hank looked at her, and his face held none of the warmth she'd come to expect. "There's a difference between weak and principled, and if you can't see it, that's your blindness, not mine." Ray picked up her naginata and walked out, and neither of them spoke for the rest of the day. But that night, she found a second egg on her plate, and the water outside her door was fresh, and the message was clear. The argument didn't change what they were to each other. It just made the edges more honest. They came at night, as these things always came, when the dark made it easier to be cruel. Ray heard the hooves first and was out of her room with the naginata before the first torch cleared the southern ridge. 6 riders, torches lit, rifles across their saddles, and they weren't here to talk. The barn went up first. Someone threw a torch through the door, and the dry hay did what dry hay does, turning the structure into a column of fire that lit the valley like a second sun. 2 of Slade's men shot into the cattle pen to scatter the animals, which milled and screamed and threw themselves against the fence rails. Jed ran out with a shotgun and caught a rifle butt across the face that dropped him in the dirt. Tucker stood in the cabin doorway, frozen. Hank came out last, carrying nothing, his body rigid with the kind of fury that comes when everything you've built is burning and the only tool you've allowed yourself is patience. Ray moved through the firelight like something the flames had produced. The naginata caught the first rider across the chest and took him out of his saddle, and the second met the blade flat against his forearm, which broke the bone with a sound like a dry branch snapping. She didn't kill them. The fact that she didn't was a choice she made between one heartbeat and the next, a calculation that had nothing to do with mercy and everything to do with the fact that Hank was watching. The third and fourth came together, and the naginata answered with reach and precision. She disarmed the third, put the blade against the fourth's throat, and held him while the other 2 survivors rode south hard, leaving their fallen in the dirt. "Tell Slade," Ray said to the man under her blade, her voice carrying no more emotion than the steel against his skin, "that the next time his men ride onto this property, I won't let them leave." He rode south with his arm hanging wrong, and the night closed behind him like a door slamming. The aftermath was quiet and awful. The barn was gone, a skeleton of charred posts glowing orange in the dark. 2 cattle lay dead in the corral. Jed sat against the cabin wall with blood on his face. Hank sat on the porch step in the glow of his burning barn, and he said nothing for a long time. "I'm grateful you were here," Hank said, his voice steady in a way that had nothing to do with calm. "But I need to ask you something. Don't kill for me. I can't hold this together if the cost of keeping it is someone else's blood on my hands. I didn't kill anyone tonight. I know, but next time might be different." Ray looked at the burning barn, at the dead cattle, at Jed's bloodied face, at the empty hands of a man whose principles had just cost him half of everything he owned. "The frontier doesn't give you choices, Hank. It gives you problems, and you solve them or you don't. Then I need you to solve them the way you solved them tonight, without a body count." She didn't answer because she wasn't sure she could make that promise, and lying to him was something she found she didn't want to do. Instead, she knelt beside Jed and opened the lacquered box, her hands going to work on the old man's wounds with the same steady precision, the herbs and needles doing their quiet work while the barn smoldered. Hank watched her hands move, and for the first time he saw the cost on her face. The exhaustion that lived beneath the discipline. The old sadness that surfaced when her guard came down. She was tired. Not the tiredness of a single night, but the kind that accumulates over years of fighting and never stops. 3 days after the fire, a message arrived, nailed to the fence post at the south boundary. Slade was bringing his full crew to take the spring, and he'd hired a new enforcer to deal with the woman with the blade. A man who'd come from across the Pacific, the message said. Someone who understood Japanese weapons and Japanese weakness. Ray read the message, and the temperature in the room dropped. Her face went through a change Hank had never seen. A transformation that started in the eyes and spread outward until the woman who'd been mending his fence and treating his ranch hands was gone, and someone older stood in her place. She went to her room and came back with the lacquered box. She opened it on the table and took out the folded paper, spreading it flat, the characters staring up at the lamplight like something that had been waiting a long time to be seen. "His name is Kenjiro Tate," Ray said, and the name came out of her mouth like something she'd been carrying in her teeth. "He was trusted by my family in Japan. My father gave him land, a place in our household. He repaid that trust by stealing the land, burning our home, and killing my father and my younger sister. He fled before justice could reach him, and I followed him across the Pacific." She touched the lock of black hair that lay beside the paper, a strand tied with silk cord, careful with it in a way that had everything to do with the fact that it was the last piece of someone she'd loved. "I've been hunting him for 3 years. The bounty work paid for the search. Every man I took down, every purse I collected, it all pointed here. And now he's working for your cattle baron 2 valleys over, and I've been mending your fence while he sat there planning whatever Slade is planning." Hank looked at the paper, the hair, the box. "And what happens when you find him?" "I end it." "Then what?" The question landed in the room like something thrown. Ray looked at Hank, and for a moment the cold precision in her eyes wavered, the way steel bends before it either holds or snaps. "Then the promise is kept. Then the dead are honored. Then I stop carrying the box." Hank leaned forward, his voice low and direct. "Ray, revenge won't bring them back. It's not about bringing them back. It's about honor. A promise made to the dead. And what about the living? What about the people who need you here? What about Jed, who can't ride for a week? What about me?" She stood up, and the naginata came with her as if it had heard its name. "You don't understand. You've never had someone taken from you like that. You've never made a promise to a grave." Hank's face changed. The old darkness surfaced, and his voice came out quiet and hard. "I told you a man died because of a choice I made with a rifle. I didn't tell you it was my brother. I didn't tell you I promised his grave I'd never pick up a gun again. So don't tell me I don't understand promises to the dead." The silence that followed was the loudest thing either of them had ever not said. Something passed between them that wasn't argument and wasn't agreement, but was recognition. 2 people standing on opposite sides of the same wound. She picked up the naginata, tucked the box under her arm, and walked to the door. "I'm not running. I'm hunting. I'll find Tate before he comes here." Hank stood in the doorway and watched her saddle the horse he'd lent her, the one he'd raised from a colt. She mounted with the naginata across her back and rode south into the early morning light without looking back. And Hank stood in the doorway until the ridge swallowed her shape, and then he went inside and didn't come out for a long time. The ride to Slade's ranch took the better part of a day, and Ray spent it alone with the name and the memory and the weight of a blade sharpened for one purpose. She thought about her sister, not the death but the life before it. Tomoe had been 4 years younger, quick to laugh, terrible with the naginata, but determined to learn anyway. The memory was so clear it could have been yesterday, which was the cruelest thing about remembering the dead. They never aged. They stayed frozen at the moment before everything went wrong. Slade's ranch had more of everything except the things that mattered. A main house built from milled lumber, bunkhouses for 24 men. The whole spread had the feel of a place built by taking things rather than making them. She found Tate through a bunkhouse window. He was older, the years having carved lines into a face that had once been handsome the way predatory animals are handsome. He wore Western clothes now, a gun belt on his hips, his hair cut short, and he looked like a man who'd remade himself so completely that the person he'd been in Japan was someone he'd murdered along with the family he'd destroyed. But she could see the fear in the way he moved, the way he checked the door, the way his hand went to the gun when a board creaked. He'd been running for 3 years, and the running had worn grooves into his body that no clothing could cover. Ray sat on the ridge through the night. The naginata lay across her knees, the box open beside her. She watched Tate's shadow go still behind the curtain, and she planned the morning with precision and the certainty that the blade would do what it had always done. But somewhere between midnight and dawn, something shifted. She watched Tate try to sleep with his hand on the gun, his body never fully relaxing, and she recognized it because she did the same thing. She slept with a naginata across her lap and her back against a wall, and the recognition landed in her like a blade she hadn't seen coming. He was afraid of her. He'd been afraid for 3 years. He'd crossed an ocean to escape the promise she'd made at her sister's grave, and the fear had eaten him from the inside the way rust eats iron. She opened the box, read the name, touched the lock of hair, and the memory of Tomoe's laugh was so close it could have been sitting beside her. And then Ray did something she hadn't done in 3 years, something she'd held behind a wall of discipline and the cold geometry of revenge. She cried. Not much and not for long, but the tears came and she let them, and when they were done, something shifted inside her like a lock turning on a door she'd sealed shut. Killing Tate in cold blood would make her exactly what he was. Her honor wasn't in the blade, or the blood, or a promise the dead couldn't collect. Her honor was in the choice, and the choice was bigger than the kill. She folded the paper, closed the box, and turned the horse north. The sun came up behind her, and she rode toward Hank's ranch like a woman walking out of a room she'd been locked in for 3 years. Hank was sitting on the porch when she rode in, and the fact that he was there told her he'd never gone to bed. He stood up when he saw her, and his face held the kind of relief that people only show when they've been preparing for the opposite. Ray dismounted and stood in front of him, with the naginata on her back and the box under her arm. "I'm not going to kill him. I'm going to bring him to a marshal. There's a warrant for Tate in California territory, a real one, for the murder of my father and my sister. I've carried it for 2 years. The law can have him, and my hands stay clean." Hank looked at her for a long moment, and what she saw wasn't triumph or relief, but something quieter, the look of a man seeing someone he cares about choose the harder path and knowing what it cost. And Slade? One problem at a time. Slade's gang arrived the next afternoon, 12 men on horseback with Tate riding at the front. They came expecting a rancher alone and a woman who'd ridden south and not come back. What they found instead was Ray standing on the porch with the naginata in her hands, and beside her, Hank Dalton holding a rifle. The rifle shook in his hands. Not much, but enough that Ray could see it, and the sight of it told her what this moment cost him. He hadn't picked up a gun since the day his brother died, and the stock against his shoulder was a violation of every promise he'd made to himself, and he was doing it anyway. Not because he'd changed his mind about violence, but because she shouldn't stand alone. Ray moved through Slade's men like a current through a narrow channel, fast and focused, the naginata sweeping in arcs that disarmed and disabled and left men groaning in the dirt without crossing into killing. Hank fired 3 shots into the air, warning shots that split the noise like thunder, and the sound of a rifle from a ranch that was supposed to be defenseless was enough to break the charge's momentum. Then Tate came through the chaos, a revolver in his hand, his face twisted with the desperation of a man who'd run out of places to run. The naginata caught his wrist before the revolver cleared leather. The blade pressed against his throat, and the fight around them stopped because the air itself seemed to hold its breath. In Tate's eyes, Ray saw the man who'd burned her home, and beneath it, the man who'd been afraid of her for 3 years. And beneath that, she saw something she hadn't expected. She saw herself. 2 people shaped by the same act of violence, one running and one chasing. And the blade between them was the only thing keeping them from becoming the same person. She lowered the naginata. Tate spat at her feet, and she didn't flinch. "You're coming with me to a marshal in Prescott. There's a warrant with your name on it." Slade watched his enforcer disarmed and his crew broken, and whatever he was running behind his flat eyes produced a result he didn't like. He rode south with the men who could still ride, and the dust settled over the ranch like the end of something that had been building too long. Hank set the rifle down on the porch. His hands were still shaking, and he looked at them like they belonged to someone else, then looked at Ray and said nothing, because the moment was bigger than words. She bound Tate's wrists with the same cord she'd used on Deacon Pie in the Lost Spur Saloon, and the symmetry wasn't lost on her. The first bounty and the last, both taken with the same blade and the same knot, but the woman holding the cord was not the same woman who'd walked into that saloon. 3 days later, Ray rode back from the marshal's office in Prescott with a receipt for a wanted man. The warrant from California Territory would send Tate back to face a trial, and Ray's part in it was finished. The pouch she kept separate from everything else was heavier by the bounty on Tate's head, and the box under her arm was lighter by the weight of a name she'd carried for 3 years. The barn was being rebuilt. Jed was on the roof, hammering with his good arm. Hank was on the ground, passing lumber up, and when he saw her riding in, he set the lumber down and stood in the yard. Ray dismounted and walked to the cabin. She hung the naginata on the wall above the door, blade down, the shaft vertical, the curve of the steel pointing toward the floor. The way a warrior hangs a weapon when the fighting is done, not put away, but placed, visible and ready, but no longer in the hand. She set the lacquered box on the shelf by the window, and she left it open. The paper with Tate's name faced outward. The lock of hair lay beside it, the silk cord still tied. And the box stayed open because some grief needs air the way a wound needs air to heal. Hank came to the doorway and looked at the blade on the wall, then the open box, then her. "The fence on the south ridge still needs mending," he said. She picked up the tools. They walked out together, and the afternoon sun fell across the grass and the cattle, in the cabin where a blade hung above the door and a box stayed open on the shelf. The naginata hangs above the door, blade down, catching the last light of the evening through the window. The box stays open. The fence gets mended. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels.